Welcome, IT changemakers, to the DEX Show with Tim Flower and Tom McGraw. Let's get into it.
Hello, changemakers. Welcome to the DEX Show. I'm Tom McGraw. Tim Flower is in the proverbial house as ever, and we are recording this show having really quite recently hosted this year's Experience Everywhere events. Tim, I think it's fair to say we enjoyed ourselves.
That was it was a blast, Tom. We always have fun with you and I going back and forth, but the Experience Everywhere was really something that was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And if you did miss the events but would like to check out some of the many highlights, check the show notes and visit the on-demand site. But don't do it this second because we have an amazing guest today on the DEX Show, someone I know we've been trying to get on the show for a while, and that's Charles Araujo. Charles, welcome to the DEX Show.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here with you guys.
Excellent. And Charles, you are, of course, a tech analyst and an internationally recognized authority on leadership in the digital era. But I read that your professional journey began at the age of 10 with, in your own words, a Commodore 64 and a screwdriver. So, look, I wanted to start with that. My first question for you is, isn't 10 years old a bit young to be drinking cocktails? I mean, sounds highly sophisticated, but maybe a little bit on the young side.
Well, let me just say that says a lot more about you than it does, all right?
Maybe so. I see a screwdriver. I only see one thing. It's a drink. But a little more seriously, we are here, of course, to talk about digital. Well, we do talk a lot here about digital transformation, something we know is a huge focus in your work. To some extent, of course, digital transformation is not just a process that happens within businesses or industries. It's something that's happened to society at large over the last few decades in particular. And over the last couple of years, we've seen a particular intensification of that process. We would, I think, all agree. I mean, what are your reflections on that intensification and where you see it going next?
So, for me, it's interesting because as the sort of saying goes, I was talking about digital transformation before it was cool. I started, it's going back 6-7 years. And at the time, nobody was really talking about it, at least not the way we are now. And certainly not in the way it got super mega uber hyped up, right? Where it's like everything is about quote unquote digital transformation today. And that's a challenge in my mind because people have sort of lost the true meaning and essence of what it was supposed to mean. Okay. So, I think it's been an interesting journey. On the one hand, I'm gratified and happy that people recognize that there was a transformation to be had. But I still think, quite frankly, most people have sort of missed the boat of what it really is all about. And my favorite story about this actually is it's already 2 years old, but there was a study done. And in it, there were two big numbers that kind of, and I'm going to butcher the actual numbers, but it was something like, they asked about the status of a bunch of executives and where you're at on your digital transformation journey. And 38% or some number said they hadn't done anything. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Nothing? We've been talking about this for years. That is and you haven't touched it? How could that possibly be? But the number that was even more staggering to me was something like 20% said they were done. And it's like, okay, wow. If you think you're done,
finished,
then you missed the boat. You probably haven't started either. You just think you are. And so it's one of those things where it's a topic that deserves a whole lot more attention and really getting past the surface of the buzzword.
Excellent. Let's drill into the buzzword then, or through the buzzword, if you will, a little bit, because one of the observations I've always found really compelling of yours around digital transformation is that when we see it within industries in particular, it's not really a consequence of any technological shift per se, so much as a new way of thinking about the industries these disruptors disrupt. Is that an accurate representation of your view?
Yeah, and in fairness, it's an evolution. I think when I started talking about it, I actually came from talking about IT transformation. And I was actually giving a talk in New Zealand at something called the Digital Disruption Conference. And it was for the first time, my audience wasn't IT executives. It was startups and CEOs and academics. And it was like, well, how does all of this stuff that I've been focused on actually apply more broadly? And that's what caused me to focus on digital transformation. But to your point, at that stage, 6, 7 years ago, we were really focused on sort of the disruptive side of it, of understanding that things were changing, but we didn't really grasp why or how or what that actually meant. And so the evolution in my mind over the last several years has been this recognition that digital transformation, I think, and in fact, I think this goes back to your first question, why it's sort of gone wrong in people's minds, because it's not actually about digital. It's not about technology. What it's really about is this fundamental shift in, I'll call it the power center. And what I mean by that is historically the way enterprise organizations, large organizations created value was basically through optimization. It was, we had this big giant supply chain. I mean, the traditional supply chain is back in the news again because we see what happens when it gets disrupted, right? But you had the supply chain and the way you created value was all about optimizing it. Every ounce of value that you could wring out of it dropped straight to the bottom line, right? I mean, Walmart was basically built on their ability, Amazon too, largely, right? Built on their ability to optimize that supply chain. But what we saw with people like Amazon and other digital players was that they weren't actually disrupting that. They weren't disrupting that operational model. What they were disrupting was the customer experience. They were disrupting the way people interacted with the brand and with the organization and with their products. And that's what was becoming the driver of value. And we've seen this sort of slow march in it. And so I talk now about this idea of the digital experience supply chain. The fact that now that doesn't mean that the traditional supply chain is not necessary. Again, we're living through that right now where we see that it is still a critical component, but it's sort of the table stakes, right? You have to execute effectively there. But where you win in the marketplace across the spectrum with your customers, with your partners, with your employees is by creating, curating, and sustaining a differentiated experience, an experience that people want to show up for. And that's the big shift. And so when I think about what digital transformation is all about, it's about that. It's about transitioning the purpose of technology as its core driver of value away from optimization as its primary to the sort of experiential posture. And that's where I think most people miss it. They end up, digital transformation is about just another technology project, and that's where they completely miss the boat.
Yeah, now I'll admit, Charles, to reading some of your material, that's kind of where I think I missed the boat as well. So in my 30 plus years in enterprise IT, the bulk of what I did was to bring in automation to get rid of the commodity, repetitive tasks that IT would perform to make IT better without really thinking about the individual, right? Or the impact on business. It was more about IT. And I also never really applied it to me as an individual worker. I'm the one that finds the automation. I'm not the one that's going to be automated. So I took some of your advice and I applied it to my day-to-day job, what I do now at NextThink as an evangelist and as a communicator. And there are some things that we could automate, write things down so you don't have to speak all the time, record it in audio like we're doing today, or even in video, and then maybe apply some AI so that people can consume the pieces that are relevant to them. But it raises the question for me, how do we decide what we should automate and what we shouldn't automate, right? It goes to your kind of prevailing thought of anything we can reduce to an algorithm, we will automate. What's the deciding factor of what to automate and what not to?
Well, first of all, don't feel bad. I think, we all went through this. I won't bore you guys with the story right now, but that's what technology was used for. That's what we all did.
Sure.
Right? And that's why this mindset shift is so difficult and so involved. But there's actually, I think, two answers to your question. A very kind of detailed one that is probably more than we get into in this conversation, and a higher level. I'm a big believer in this idea of true northing, right? Kind of set your sights on the thing that is your guiding light as you go forward. And the guiding light for what you automate is always about the experience. Mm-hmm. It's always about the experience that you want to create for your customers, the experience that they find of value. And I say customers, but it's the consumer of the automation or the technology that you're bringing to bear, right? So it can easily be an employee or partner because they're just as important today when we talk about this. But I don't mean to be trite by saying, oh, just the experience. What I mean by that is that we have to start by understanding, well, what kind of experience are we trying to create and curate? I mean, the biggest gap that most people have is they never even ask that question. Right? They start with like, okay, we got a piece of technology. What can we use it for? Right? So starting with the consumer of this, and then ask yourself, is this going to make it better or worse? Is this going to get me to a place where they are delighted with this experience, And that is going to drive either better outcomes if it is employee, better productivity, or increase sales or increase satisfaction if they're a customer, whatever that barometer is, right? So the two things that we have to start with is what is the outcome we're trying to achieve? How are we measuring that? Can we measure it? And then what is the experience that we need to deliver to create that outcome? And then ask, will this automation help me get there? Right. So, I think so many of the challenges we have in IT in general, I mean, I'm an old IT guy, right? So many of the challenges have less to do with the technology, or it has to do with sequencing. I was talking to a friend of mine who's an evangelist at another tech company, and she was saying, I go in, I don't want to talk about our product. I go, no. Talking about your product is great. As a buyer, I want to know about your product. I just want it in the right order.
Right.
It's about the sequence. I want to know that you understand the problems that I'm trying to solve, the challenges that I'm grappling with, that you have empathy with that. And then in that context, I'm all ears about how your technology can help me solve it. But it's about sequencing. And so when we're doing this internally as an IT organization or as an IT provider of that technology, it's the same thing. The sequencing is what's all important. And so how do you know which to automate? Start with the consumer of that technology, start with that experience, and then work your way backwards, and that will guide it.
Yeah, constantly asking that question, why or what next? Why am I doing this versus just doing it for the sake of technology? You mentioned this concept of the experience supply chain. Expand on that a little bit. How does it differ from, say, the traditional organizational structures? And it strikes me that the experience supply chain is also about sequencing, doing things in the right order in order to get the right experience. But expand on that concept a bit.
So the fundamental premise is no different than a traditional supply chain where we add value. It's a linear progression. You take a raw good, every step of the way you add value to it until you get to a finished product. The fundamental premise here is that if the way we're creating value is by delivering this experience, then we have to start with that experience and ask, how are we creating it? What that inevitably leads to when you have that honest discussion and you ask yourself, well, what experience am I trying to create? How is it going to create value in the market for me and my organization and for my customers? What that inevitably is going to lead to is a transformation of your business model, because our entire business models across the entire enterprise spectrum have all been built around optimization, right? It was all about driving that. And so once you start flipping that upside down and it's the experience first, then you quickly realize that the business models themselves are the very first barrier to delivering that experience for our customer, right? And we have to start with the end customer. But then the second you start re-envisioning your business model, the second thing you're going to recognize is that your operating model also was aligned to support the traditional business model. Right. So the second transformation is within your operating model structure. And the minute you do that and you start re-envisioning and transforming your operating model, then you start realizing your fundamental work and management models are also aligned to these traditional ways of doing things, and you have to re-transform those. And then the last thing that makes the experience, the digital experience supply chain different conceptually is that whereas the traditional supply chain was linear, this is iterative. It's a regressive loop, because what happens is our experiential demands as a consumer, employee, or partner are continually changing. They are much more ephemeral than the traditional sort of value models. And so that experiential expectations change, and that means this whole process is in this constant loop. And the reality is it's not even as linear as I just described it, because all of these are like little mini loops within them, because you're continually having to modify and update your business model, operating model, work model all together. And then to the point we made a bit ago, none of this is to suggest that traditional supply chains and traditional operating models, in terms of the ability, you still have to deliver a good from point A to point B. You still have to do it efficiently and optimize all of that, because you have to continue to take those costs out. So what we're really talking about is this is sitting on top of. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's so hard. And that's why, honestly, people are sort of, not going down that road, because it's like, oh my gosh, one more thing to do. But it's the only way that you're winning. And if you look at who's winning in the marketplace as kind of the digital natives, or whatever you want to call them, they're doing this. They're doing it. They did it from the ground up, but they're doing this.
Amazing. I mean, so far we've focused in on the dynamic between companies and customers. How do you see the dynamic between employees and employers being impacted, however, by the same forces that we've looked at so far?
It's actually the challenge I have. So I'm a huge believer in both the employee experience as a value driver itself. We do have a war on talent, so it's in its own right important, right? Because we all want to work for companies that are progressive and doing interesting things and that care about my experience as that employee. But beyond the just esoteric element of it, the reality is I think where people miss it on the employee experience or their view of it is they look at it in isolation, that it is part of this entire experience supply chain. And it's probably the part that's hardest to see, at least on paper. And it's the easiest to see in reality. So one of my stories about this is my father, who is about as untechy as it comes, had, and I won't name it mostly because I don't remember who it is, but he had one of the major cell phone providers, right? The AT&T Verizons of the world, one of them. And he went in to make a change. He had bought something and he needed to like return it and change the plan to do with it, whatever it was. A very simple change. And he walked in and the person he's talking to is saying, oh yeah, I totally get it. That's perfectly fine, right? There's no controversy in this. And he went into the system that he was using on the back end, right? So this is an employee facing system to try to facilitate my dad's need. An hour later, he says, well, apparently because you bought this at this store, at this other branch, I can't do this. You're going to have to go there. So my dad had to get in his car and drive this other one and then spent another hour with them.
Wow.
That guy still couldn't figure this out and finally said, you know what? Forget it. Here, I'm just going to give you whatever it was to make this problem go away. And so these were two people that were doing everything in their power to deliver a positive customer experience. But because the employee experience, the system that they had to use on the back end was so built around this idea of optimization, it wasn't built in mind with how do I best service the customer. They literally couldn't do this. So I think they salvaged it barely. But that horrible employee experience, which we haven't even talked about the frustration that I'm sure these employees had of not being able to meet the needs of their customer. Right? But just, you look like an idiot. You just wasted hours of your time. I mean, all of this stuff. And so I think, and this is, Tim, we are inadvertently guilty of setting this up,
Sure.
right? Because we all built these systems that were all focused on taking out costs.
Yep.
They were all about efficiency, and we weren't thinking about that. And then, we have all these systems that have been around now for a decade sometimes. And we aren't making those transitions. And so there's a massive connection between the employee experience and the customer experience and how it drives value. And the hard part is, had that gone south and my dad had said, forget this, I'm going to go to another company, no one ever would have seen it. The data on that, to be able to connect the failed customer experience to the failed employee experience, is incredibly difficult to see unless you get out there into the field and actually watch it. And my last little, sorry, I'm bombing you with stories, but my last little story about this, of how this plays out and why this is so problematic. I was running a large project, a multi-year project for a large federal agency. And so as a result, I was in Washington, D.C. 3 times, or about every 3 weeks. And because I was there so often, I got to know the general manager of the hotel I stayed at. Always a bad sign. When they recognize you by
Right.
face, it's like, okay. But he and I were both fans of wine, and so we sort of struck up this friendship. And so we're sitting one night over a bottle of wine that, of course, he brought, that's awesome. Free wine's always good. We're talking, and he asked me what I do, and I was explaining it. And, a couple glasses in, he sort of let his guard down, and he said these words that I will never forget. He says, Charlie, if my IT department would just come and spend one day with me at my hotel and see how their systems affect my ability to serve my guests, I think everything would change, right? And what he was talking about was the fact that his systems, the employee experience, the systems that he was having to work with, were literally at odds with his ability to provide great service to his guests, right? So these are the connections that we see. And so it's our job, all of us, to uncover those things, to find the breadcrumbs that indicate those connection points and where they are disconnected and causing issues.
This is one of my best experiences as an enterprise IT individual, is traveling to visit 40 field offices at my prior employer. And I would go to some offices that would say, we have never had an IT individual step foot in this building. And to hear not only hear the feedback, but to actually see and experience what they were experiencing brought back a whole new perspective when I went back to the home office. And it drove the whole notion of kind of communicating to our executives that we're in the dark. We don't know what these people are experiencing. And, I really love your concept of no longer being able to optimize that supply chain to profitability. There's more value in the experience side in being able to extract value and differentiate with improved experience versus improved commoditization, right? We've already squeezed that rock for all that it will give us.
And that is exactly it. Even if all this other stuff wasn't true, that is the point, is that, if you are not already driving high levels of optimization and efficiency, well, then you've got bigger problems, right? So it's about where do you go next and how do you create differentiation in the marketplace?
I mean, is experience turning us all into consumers even at work? Is the movement from SLAs to XLAs, the sort of pervasive power of experience in every aspect of our lives, effectively completing the consumerization of work itself? Is that an exaggeration or is that accurate?
I don't think it's an exaggeration at all. I mean, I think the dynamics are a little bit different, right? One of the big things on the customer side is that part of the byproduct of all of the digitally driven innovation that we've seen over the last decade, it means we've seen incredibly reduced switching costs across the board, any industry. The switching costs are, with the exception of heavy industrial, maybe, the switching costs are very, very low. I think part of the reason that we've seen the employee experience side of this lag a little bit is that switching costs are still a little bit harder. It's a bigger deal to go switch jobs. But as we're seeing with the Great Resignation, as we're seeing right now with the Gen Zs, much more willing to make those steps, much less inclined to just stick with the company. I was talking to my son the other day, and he had started a new job. And I talked to him, and like 3 months in, he goes, I'm not happy with the way these guys are working. I'm going to start looking, right? I never would have thought of that. I mean, the old rule was like, if it didn't, they could be pouring hot boiling water or oil on you, and you were sticking out for at least 2 years, right? I mean, so we're seeing a generational shift in sort of the viewpoint around it. And so that the war for talent is certainly making that an issue, but there is a greater stickiness with employees than there is with customers still. And so I think that's why we're seeing a lag, but there's no doubt about the consumerization. And I think what's interesting from a tech standpoint, so playing this out, putting my analyst hat on, is that we're seeing that fight in sort of the legacy tech players whose UIs are less modern. And even if they create a more modern veneer that sits on top of it, you get one layer deep and it starts having some experiential issues. They're starting to struggle because organizations are recognizing that they've got to update their technology internally to compete. So I think we're absolutely seeing that consumerization across the board. But I think from the employee side, it's a little bit of a different animal.
Yeah. So since we're still at the individual level, down at the employee, let's explore it a little bit more. So what can an organization do to get started, right? I think I'll summarize one of the things that you just made a comment on. This is hard, right? Oh my God, I'm not even going to get started because this is a heavy lift. This is a lot of work. And I love your advice. Just do something, anything, just do something. It doesn't need to be a lot, but do anything. How do enterprises address the human change management aspect of this shift? And what maybe down to an individual technologist, what can an individual do to kind of change and get into this innovative mindset and take action?
So two very different answers based on sort of the audience. So I'll start with the sort of management layer of this, right? The part of the challenge with all of this change and with getting people is that, been here, done that. We've all heard it before. I used to run large scale transformation programs, and what I heard most consistently was, it's like, okay, this all sounds great. And, as they're rolling their eyes but, we've heard it all before and nothing ever changes. So why am I going to invest myself in this now? So the most important thing as an organization where you start is not with some big grand plan and, we're going to transform. It's starting with empathy and trust. You have to start by saying, right, going back to that experiential true north, saying, first and foremost, we're going to go down this road because we actually care about changing and improving the experience. And that needs to start by no different than you talked about going out to those field offices to understand how it's affecting the customer. Go in the field offices and understand how it's affecting them, right? And listening to see that, to understand what that is, and to look for those places where you have the opportunity to demonstrate empathy and to create trust. And that means focusing on small wins. And I hate the idea of low-hanging fruit because it's not about easy. In fact, the most important thing is the small, hard thing. that demonstrates that you are actually going to invest in this and make it better, right? So from an organizational standpoint, that's where I'd start. Individually, I think especially as a technologist, and I'm as much as I talk about all this stuff and write about it and speak on stage, I'm still a techie, and I'm just as guilty of this as anybody, is that I love the technology. I love getting into it. And it's like, that's why I had a Commodore 64 and my screwdriver, because it's like, oh, this is cool. Let's go see what this can do. And what we have to, so the most important thing you have to do as a technologist is to stick that in a drawer and go, I'm glad you think the technology is all whiz bang and fun and cool. Your customer, your consumer of this technology doesn't. They have an objective, a problem they're trying to solve, and all they care about is how this is going to solve it. So the enthusiasm is great, but don't focus on the technology. Stick that away for right now and listen. Go out and just listen. And when that happens, a few things start transpiring. First of all, it can completely reset your roadmap. You can completely change how you're going to go forward. Sometimes what you realize is that it's actually not your technology at all. Sometimes it's a training issue. Sometimes it's a communication issue, right? And so there's all these different things that happen when we stop assuming. I was just talking to a good friend of mine who by the way, because this doesn't exist just on a individual layer, right? So he really works with CIOs a lot, and he ends up being this sort of buffer between CIOs and tech companies. And I say, these big companies have these relationship with these, enterprise CIOs. Why do they need you? He goes, because the CIOs don't tell them the truth, right? Because right, it's about getting under the covers to find out what's actually happening. And so no matter what level you are, it's about listening. It's about doing exactly what you were talking about, just getting out there, showing some humility, not immediately jumping to the answer. It's sort of like, my wife told me once when we were sitting down, she goes, sometimes I just need you to listen. I don't need you to give me a solution.
Sure.
Right? I just need to start. And so I think, that is the best place to start. And then there's a whole bunch of other techniques, as far as mechanisms and structures and lots of other things you can do. But as a starting point, that will open your eyes and open the doors.
I'm interested, Charles, if the next question elicits a different answer or a reiteration of that same point. It's around engagement. We're hearing a lot at the moment about the Great Resignation. It gives businesses another big thing to think about, of course. Can modern day IT, can modern day technology step up here and help HR teams to build more responsive companies and to better retain talent? Is there a way that technology can become a solution to some of these issues rather than just a kind of a set of tools that helps people do other things?
Absolutely. But I don't know those are also at counterpoints. I think that the biggest challenge that most employees have, there's, again, I don't want to be reductive here. There's lots of elements, right? There's corporate culture issues. There's communication issues. There's lots of different. So when we talk about employee engagement, technology is never going to be the sole answer. But if you look at some of that data, one of the big complaints is that employees waste time. They spend a whole bunch of time doing things that are not either adding value to whatever their job function is or enriching them personally in any way, right? And so who wants to do that? Nobody wants to do that, right? So there's, part of the reason I'm a huge fan of the low-code movement as an example is because, or maybe more the no-code side of this, I kind of look at it all as one, but is that it gives us the ability to put some of this technology in the hands of a consumer for them to do their own, to solve their own problems and to just get the heck out of their way. It's like, what do you need? If something is in your way, go do it. Tim was talking about how he started looking at things he could automate for himself, right? I think, and we're seeing that across the board. Apple's use of shortcuts, the new app that they have on their phones and iPads and now on their Macs is a great way of doing that. We're seeing this across the board. Giving employees tools to just handle the stuff that they want to get handled on their own is a great way of doing that. The other thing I think is that when you look at engagement is, there's, again, lots of factors, but one of them is this sense of disconnectedness from the organization, disconnectedness from your teammates, where it feels like it's just this big giant flow of transactional activities. And what's been fascinating is during the pandemic, that's what we've seen. We've seen productivity go up because you have less interruption, less of the water cooler stuff. You have more time sitting at your computer. And in many cases, satisfaction and engagement going down because people are feeling isolated. All right. So I'm working on a new article in the metaverse in the enterprise context. And I'm actually, at the moment anyway, very bullish on it because I think it has the potential to provide at least one vehicle for reestablishing that connectedness, right? At the end of the day, organizations are human enterprises. We are collections of humans getting together around some kind of a common objective and goal to go deliver something into the market that we all then receive value from in the form of salaries or stocks or whatever it is. And it's a human endeavor. And I think that the part of the rush to optimization throughout the industrial age and over the last really 60, 70 years, but, certainly over the last, handful, decades from a technology perspective has been about taking all that humanity out. And that's what causes so much of this disengagement. So technology plays a role, but I would argue to kind of the question, it plays a different role. And so it's, some of the stuff we were talking about with Tim is about, how do I leverage technology to help them do their job? But from an employee experience, there's also this other question about how do I leverage technology to make the process of coming to work and doing my job more enjoyable and fulfilling, right? And Dan Pink's his talks about this idea of intrinsic motivation. Mm-hmm. I actually think technology can be a great enabler of those intrinsic motivators if we look at it that way. But I would say most organizations are still not doing that.
Great. Fantastic. Yep. And no, I think, Charles, great pleasure having you on. Well worth the wait. Before we let you go, do let our listeners know where they can go to follow you and your fascinating work.
Absolutely. Easiest way is on my website, charlesaraujo.com, Araujo, and pretty much on all social, I'm either Charles Araujo or author Charles Araujo, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever. So definitely follow me and keep on trucking.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charles. And that link will be in the show notes, as will the link, as we said at the top of the show, to the Experience Everywhere recordings. Please make sure you check that out if you missed them, and we will see you next time, Changemakers.
To make sure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to leave a rating of the show. Just tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. If you'd like to learn more about how NextThink can help you improve your digital employee experience, head over to nextthink.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.